All right, let's talk about our little stash buster project, which is the Under Corset Belt from Steamtorium. It's a digital pattern. You can buy it on Etsy. I know I've linked to it a couple of times. It's not very expensive pattern, and uh, it actually is a very complete little booklet of information when you download it. And it comes with instructions for making the belt, a regular pouch, and a fan holder. So those are just included in the packet for the belt, which is nice. I recommend picking up the teacup holster pattern as well if you are into those, because it's a very cute little pattern and it works really well with fabric. You could probably adjust it to make it out of leather or vinyl if that was something you wanted to do. But I've never done that personally because I have worked with leather, but I don't want to do it. It's expensive and like I can make things that are more beautiful more quickly out of fabric because that's more my skill set. But the shapes would work with leather if you want to do that. So with the belt pattern, there are a couple of things to take note of, and that is that you want to make sure when you print it out that you are printing at the right scale. So all of these, well, the reputable digital patterns will put a little 1 inch square on the page so you can measure and make sure that you've printed stuff out to the right scale. And I recommend checking before you've printed all of the pattern pieces because not all printers are created equal and they don't all cooperate. So then what I tend to do, because I do this with almost every pattern ever, is I copy out the size I want onto some vellum or some sort of craft paper. In this case, I just traced it out onto a scrap of my Swedish tracing paper, which can be sewn together. Um, I've started using this a lot more. It's very akin to interfacing. And so I'm going to make a recommendation that if you think you're not going to make a bunch of these, you're just going to make the one today, or you might make one in the future, perhaps. You could actually just trace your pattern pieces onto interfacing, the interfacing that you're going to use for the project, and use that interfacing to be your pattern pieces. So it will absolutely work. But anyway, I used Swedish tracing paper because that was very convenient. And my interfacing happens to be black, which is like hard to see, whereas the white is very easy for you guys to see on camera. I don't want a corset belt for myself because I usually wear my corsets buried under my costumes. But I've decided to make one for Eve, who is such a big help to me and the Grand Arbiter on a regular basis. This is a surprise, so Eve doesn't know where I'm making this. So I went into my stash and I looked for some fabric that said Eve to me. And the most easy portion of this was black. I'm going to make the outside out of this black cotton twill that I just happen to have in my stash. It's a little bit lighter weight than the pattern asks for. So she recommends using medium weight to upholstery weight fabrics. And I think she's doing that so that the belt will be a little bit toothy and hold up to the weight of anything you hang off of it. But what I'm going to do is take her recommendation and interface the bejesus out of this fabric. That's a technical term. Uh, so I'm just going to interface everything with fusible interfacing. So I like fusible for certain things. I don't use it a lot in my big costumes because I want something that's not going to affect the drape of the fabric as much as fusible can. So I tend to interface my costumes with cotton muslin or silk organza or different fabrics like that, that are going to move with the fabric and not affect the drape as much, even though they're going to like really give it a little bit more support and stability where it needs it. But fusible is was created for a reason. That is because it is easier to work with in some really profound ways. It is not going to slip on you once you get it attached to the fabric. And it is going to make lightweight fabrics have a little bit more toothiness. So I'm just using this delightful black fusible interfacing. I think I got it from Mood Fabrics a bajillion years ago. I might have gotten it from some other online seller, but I did buy it back in 2020 when we needed to interface masks and do all of this stuff, and you couldn't find interfacing for love nor money at your local fabric stores. So I bought scads of it, and this is what I just go to. Happens to be black because that's what it was available. The other thing I pulled from my stash, this is a really cute, spooky cotton print that has like Ouija symbols and stuff on it. This is going to be the lining of the belt, but my goal is to make the belt reversible so that Eve can decide which side they want to wear at any given moment. And then I'll probably make all the pouches and things out of this spooky fabric and the black fabric combined. So it'll be like a nice, set. So that's what I am working with. It's all cotton because I'm a harlot for cotton, and I tend to have a lot of cotton in my house. And I don't have to do a lot of adjustments with this one because Eve is a more, standard size and within a size range that's covered by the pattern. If you've looked at the pattern already, she's really good about telling you the size range. On the very second page, she goes into it. And so it runs from about a 27-inch waist to a 45-inch waist. There's a little bit of play in the size because you're tying it closed at center front. If you are like me, who needs a little bit more flexibility than that in your size, there are some approaches, and I'll talk a little bit about those things I would do to alter this pattern to make it work better for that kind of adjustability. It's a great little pattern, so that's not a dig at the pattern. That's just like sewists everywhere. I can't leave something alone. I'm always going to make it my own, right? So the other thing I plan to do for mine is that I'm going to use grommets to put a little grommet in the front opening so that Eve can swap out their ties. And so I'm not worried about the ties actually like breaking or anything. The way the pattern is drafted, you sew on a ribbon and you use that to tie. It's pretty solid construction, but I know when I wear something a lot and I put a lot of weight on it, that that kind of tie system takes a lot of strain on the stitches. And next thing you know, the stitches are popping out at the most inopportune moment. The fun thing that you can do if you want to like make it increasingly adjustable is rather than making your back piece one solid piece, you can add a seam allowance at that center back. You can open it up and you can put a couple of grommets there. You can put a little lace in the back as well to give you some adjustability. so that your belt can flex with your body and give you a little bit more room. Let's say you corset heavier in one corset than the other, or you are somebody like me where sometimes you're more bloated than other days. And so you've got some adjustment that happens with that. So, all right. Any questions as we're getting into this? Also, hello, Captain Azar. It's so good to have you here. I know I sound horrible, but I'm happy you're here. Okay, let me just check. Thank you for the compliments to the fabric, June. I really like it. I think it's going to be great. And I think Eve will like it, which is the most important part. Now, I have a lot of this fabric, so I'm not going to have to do any weird things to like work around small amounts. But it really, these pattern pieces, look at how small they are. You can absolutely get this belt out of some weird size scraps. Um, this is the back of the belt, and it should be cut. Technically, it should be cut on a fold. But you know, there's never anything stopping you from adding a small seam allowance so that you can cut it out of a smaller scrap of fabric and use up those, like, you know, 6 and 8 inch pieces of silk or upholstery fabric or something fabulous you've been hoarding that was like just enough for a little project, but maybe not enough for a whole corset or something like that. So this is a nice one for that. Oh my goodness. Generally, I'd say make sure to have your fabric pressed and ready to go. I'm not that organized today, my darlings. So we're going to make do with what I pulled out of my stash. This isn't something you need to wash in advance unless you really think you're going to wash your belt a lot. For me, this would be a garment I would never expect to wash. And so I wouldn't bother with pre-shrinking it. But if you're like, no, I want to do that, I want to make sure it's washable, just go in, pre-shrink your fabric before you start cutting. The You don't have to worry about pre-shrinking interfacing. It doesn't change size, right? So, and then just press it, make sure it's nice and flat and ready to go. So I'm going to lay this out on my fabric and show you how I would do my little bit of cutting here. It really does take a very minimal amount. Oh my goodness. And of course I'm going to use my pattern weights because you know I love pattern weights. Why pin when I can use pattern weights? See if we can do this without the camera losing its mind. There we go. Okay. So the back piece of the belt should be cut on the fold unless you intend to um, add a little grommet situation at the back to give it adjustability, or if you're like doing a little bit of fussy cutting around little scraps of fabric you have left over. Normally, I would just go in and cut this right out with my rotary cutter, and I wouldn't take the time to trace it out, but I think it's a little easier for you guys to see what I'm doing when I do trace things out. I'm just using my little Chaco chalk marking tool. I love these. They're so easy to work with compared to the normal tailor's chalk. So you can see it just takes up a very small amount of space on the fabric. I like a rotary cutter for stuff like this. The trick with a rotary cutter is always to start a little bit before your cutting line so that the wheel is fully engaged and actually cutting by the time you hit what you want to cut. You can see I didn't quite do that. So that's piece one. If you've been to any of my classes or other things, you know that I like to keep my pattern pieces with the fabric as I'm cutting it. It's just a personal habit that I find helps me keep things organized. So I know what I've cut. I I know what those random weird squiggly pieces of fabric are, all of that. In her pattern pieces, she does give you a little um, grain line marker. It's not hugely critical for projects like this, but I recommend getting into the habit of paying attention to grain lines. For this one, I'm going to be interfacing it. So the grain line only matters in so much as how the fabric looks. It won't have any bias to stretch on once I'm done fusing the heck out of it. You'll also see there are some little marks on the pattern. That's where she suggests you attach your loops that are going to have your little D rings on them and swivel hooks. Hello, Cake. I do think this belt has a really nice shape to it. It's got a good curve. If you need to adjust your belt to be a little bit wider, which I would need to do, just make sure that you're maintaining that nice curve. I recommend adding on to the interior seams that are flat seams rather than trying to split it and spread it or anything like that. Okay. So now I have my little outer body, if you will, cut. When I go in and cut my interfacing, I'm going to be trimming away a little bit of the sides so that I don't have so much bulk in my seam allowance. That's not something she recommends you do in the pattern, and it's not something you have to do necessarily, but I think it will make for a nicer finish. I'm going to need interfacing for all of my pieces because none of them are very heavyweight.
Including the lining?
Oh gosh. Yes, I'm going to interface the lining as well because it's also about the same, like it's sort of a quilting weight cotton. And she suggests you use like medium to heavyweight fabrics for all sides, for the lining as well as the shell of this belt. And she's definitely using that fabric weight to make it a little bit more burly to hold up to the weight of anything you're hanging off of it. Since I don't want to make something really thick and I don't have any upholstery fabric I like on hand, I'm just making my lighter weight fabrics be more like medium weight fabrics by interfacing them all, if that makes sense. Oh, goodness. Okay. Time to cut that interfacing. Okay. So it's basically the same process. I'm going to cut two of my back belts on the folds. You want to try and keep things kind of as even as possible as you're doing this, so that you cut your interfacing pieces as close as possible to the pattern piece. Makes it a little bit easier to get everything lined up. But there is like some wiggle room with interfacing. It's not going to show. And we're going to be trimming it down, so again, I'm just going in with my little rotary cutter friends. If you are using medium to heavyweight fabric, you probably will not need to interface as much as I am. And you should be able to get away with just interfacing one side. Or maybe you won't have to interface either side if it's really heavy. The thing to note with those upholstery fabrics, they look so fun and they come in great colors and patterns. I really like them, but they are generally warm and a little bulky. So if you're somebody who doesn't want a really thick belt under your corset, keep that in mind when you're picking your upholstery fabrics. And to my other set. I'm trying to sort of nestle my interfacing pieces in so that I'm using like kind of the least amount of interfacing possible. Not that interfacing is expensive, not that I'm worried about running out, but I usually try and be economical with things like this because then I have more interfacing for when I need it. I'm definitely not a zero waste sewist. I have friends who try never to throw away like any fabric and to use every scrap. And I absolutely appreciate the sentiment, but I just am not the right personality, I guess. Also, I work really hard not to hang on to a bunch of scraps of fabric that I'll never use because space is limited. To Okay, so interfacing is done. Now to trim that interfacing down a little bit. And again, this is really just my preference, not a necessity, but it will make your seams a little less bulky. It will make them lie a little smoother under your corset belt. And the seam allowance for this project is 3/8 of an inch, which is just over a quarter, just under a half, right? And I can really eyeball a half inch at this point because I use it so often. But 3/8 is a little bit more persnickety. So if this were something where being really pristine and really accurate mattered on the interfacing, I would actually go in and trace that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to make sure that I am cutting that amount off very evenly. Normally I would use like a little um seam gauge, but you can even go in with your clear ruler and just lightly mark along if you need it to be really even. But what I tend to do, honestly, is eyeball it. And I just want to make sure to remember to get the sides and the end. If I'm feeling very adventuresome, I just line up all of the pieces for the same part. Make sure they're really well lined up before you do this. And I'm going to trim them together. Okay, so this is ready to be added to my fashion fabric. So I'm going to set it aside with the pattern piece and the fashion fabric. So they're a little sandwich of pieces. Now I'm going to repeat that process with the front belt portion. Again, I want to make sure everything's kind of lined up before I do anything. Just going to repeat the process. This time I need to take a little bit out on all four sides of this because it has that seam. It's a little bit like pre-grading your seams, just to make sure they lay a little more smoothly. Then I get all of my pieces nice and lined up. It's a little trickier with this portion because, they're not folded together.
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know I got a message from Robin that she's waiting in the Zoom thing.
Oh,
And
she
she may
can't
have,
get
you
in.
may, you, well, she's waiting for you. She may have, I think she came in after we started.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
Thank you.
just so you
Perfect.
know.
Yes, thank you. When I have the camera facing down, I don't see people coming in. So thank you for the warning. I appreciate it. And welcome, friends. Sorry for the wait. We're just working on the interfacing for our under corset belt. Right now, I'm trimming off some of the seam allowance from the belt interfacing so that it will be a little bit smoother and have a little bit less bulky seams. Okay. So now I can set those aside. Hello, friends. Sorry again for the wait. I'm so happy you're here. Anything you missed, we're recording and it will be available to watch at a later date. But you really only missed cutting. So, oh, congratulations, Robin, on the good news. Talk to you later, dear June. Please take care. Okay. Yeah, and don't stand on ceremony, everyone. If something's up and I'm not catching it or somebody messages, just unmute yourselves and let me know. Because this is our time together. It's pretty informal. Okay, so now I'm going to pull out my pattern fabric that is going to be the lining, but I'm going to construct this in a way so that it can be reversible. And so I want to cut my little pieces out of that. When I'm doing something like this with a pattern, I have a choice ahead of me. Do I pattern match? In this case, the answer is probably not. But sometimes I'm like, yeah, it look really sharp if I did. What I'll probably do, however, is make sure I like what is centered inside of the pattern piece so that I think it'll look cute. I don't want to like necessarily decapitate any bats, in other words. Or maybe I do. I don't know. We're gonna see what looks cute. This is fabric I've had in my stash for like 5 or 6 years. I bought it from a friend who was destashing, and at the time, the Grand Arbiter and I were like, "Yeah, we're gonna make a spooky Ouija themed underpinning set." And then the world caught on fire, and we were like, "Or not. I don't know what we'll do with this fabric." So I'll still have enough left over, though, if I ever change my mind, I'll still be able to make a spooky set of underpinnings. With your pattern fabric, check to see if it has a directionality, if there's a top or a bottom, um, what the repeat is on the pattern, get a good sense of it. This one does have a directionality. There is a top because it has writing on it and all of the writing is facing the same way. So as I am going in and cutting this, I want to make sure that I'm happy with how the um the the writing is laying on the garment. So oh, yeah, I love this. Alicia said caftans for tea readings or chinois style robes. And Joanne said she made Regency dress fabric, Regency day dress out of the very similar fabric. It's great fabric. I might have to use it for like a tea gown or a smoking jacket, or at least part of it, or something, because we keep doing the spooky tea leaf reading. Speaking of, actually, this is a great like non sequitur. The Grand Arbiter and I want to rename that panel something a little bit more florid than spooky tea leaf reading. So if you have opinions or vibes on how to name that panel, I am accepting recommendations. Okay. So the nice thing about using something like this is that um, it is a little bit sheer, so I can see the print of the fabric through it. Oh my gosh. I have maybe 10, 15 more minutes. That was my sign that my voice is about to give out entirely. So we're going to at least finish cutting. All right, let's take a look at this little portion. Okay, so things I know about Eve. They love moths. So I'm going to make sure this moth motif is centered in part of the belt. I'm just gonna like line this center back piece up so that the moth is really captured within the seam allowance. And if you want to be really, really particular, and you're really concerned about your print and you want it to lie the best and be sort of organized the best way so your print looks really good on both sides, it's a good idea to actually cut out the full pattern piece so you can cut on the flat instead of the fold. I'm not going to be that fussy with a project of this scope, but it is a good idea to just like unfold the fabric, make sure I'm not, horrified by any choices I've made. Looks pretty good. I'm going to run with it. It's always that thing, right? You don't want to make it look like the ice cream cones are lined up over your nipples accidentally. If you're going to do that, you want it to be purposeful, for instance. So, not that I speak from experience or anything like that. Totally speak from experience. So once I'm happy with the layout, I just go in and I'm going to um, mark again on my fabric. You could just go in and cut directly, but this is a good way to make sure that you're happy with the layout for sure. So if I trace around the pattern, then I can go in and be like, yes, how that's all laid out looks good. I'm happy with the position of the moth. It's inside my seam allowance. It's all great. The yellow is not very visible on this fabric though. Okay. Pardon me. Now we're going to repeat that for the front of the belt. And, now I just want to again, I'm looking for some bits I like, and I like the way they line up on the belt. Do I want to capture more of that moth? Do I want to have the skull and the letters from the Ouija? I can just plop this pattern piece around until I'm happy with it. And if I want, I can even, again, open up my fabric and take a few minutes to position both sides. I am really capturing these moths a lot again because I happen to know that Eve loves moths, and so since I'm making this as a gift, it's worth it to me to take a little extra time to make sure I'm capturing the parts I think will give Eve a little burst of joy. Whatever you're doing, keep in mind that you want to make sure that the right and left sides of your belts are mirrored. In this case, because I did not cut it on the fold, means I need to physically mirror this pattern piece when I go over to the other side of the garment, because this fabric has a wrong side and a right side. One of the ways I like to do that for myself is that I take the piece that I just cut and I position it on the fabric to remind me, yeah, it needs to mirror that. Just a little reminder for myself. I'm going to capture that moth again. Eve is going to probably notice at this point that I was making sure there were lots of moths. Even being a little bit fussy with my cutting, not terribly fussy, just minorly. I still have lots of fabric left. I will have plenty to do another project. And that is going to be so cute, I think, with the two little moths here in the front. So nice. And I like the way the back piece looks as well. So next week we'll get to fusing and construction on our pieces. I'm excited. Here, got a good view of my hand. I'm excited to do that next part with you, but I am losing my voice. So we're going to be wrapping up here tonight.